submitted, titled Food and Genocide, the Interplay of Zionist Ideology and Israel's Prolonged War. We would very much welcome your feedback and thoughts, of course. And in our paper, we examine Israel's war tactics against Palestinians, specifically the use of mass starvation in Gaza, which contributes to broader strategies and tools aimed at the intentional and systematic destruction of the Palestinian people as a national, ethnical, and racial group in part and in whole. And this is done particularly through the infliction of serious bodily and mental harm and by creating destructive conditions of life for the population. And the paper highlights the links between Israel's current warfare methods and the broader Zionist Israeli settler-colonial ideology, motives, and strategy spanning over a century, including in relation to food in particular. And by analyzing Israel's systematic deprivation of food sovereignty, leading to mass starvation and famine, as observed in the Gaza Strip over the past year, the paper seeks to demonstrate that these actions form part of a sustained Israeli strategy aimed at weakening Palestinian life and resistance, establishing domination to carry out rapid elimination, and enabling settler replacement of the native population. And we do this taking into consideration two primary legal frameworks, acknowledging both their significance, but also their limitation in the plight of the Palestinian people for liberation from colonial domination and in safeguarding its existence as a people. The first is the legal framework surrounding the right to self-determination, especially as it pertains to the Palestinian people, and its link to the right to food and food sovereignty under international law, but also in practice, in the reality of the Palestinian people today. And the second, which I will be focused on, is the genocide framework, specifically the Genocide Convention, which asserts that mass starvation and famine are central to Israel's genocidal actions. And of course, to be able to thoroughly examine all of this, mass starvation cannot be analyzed in isolation. It must be examined alongside other actions and patterns of conduct by the Israeli military and government, which further exacerbate harm and impact. Analyzing the interconnections among various actions and policies of the Israeli military in Gaza, especially over the past year, is essential to addressing the question of intent as well. This is in turn crucial for proving genocide, moving beyond written policies or plans to consider also organized, repeated patterns of conduct, circumstantial evidence, and awareness of the act's ramifications. These actions include repeated forced mass displacement of the Gazan population amid ongoing air, land, and sea bombardment, the near total destruction of essential infrastructure for human life, and simultaneous prohibitions, restrictions, and targeting of humanitarian aid and food sources. And just to go over quickly the actions that Israel has taken over the past year to dismantle food systems and sovereignty in the Gaza Strip. As part of its genocide and intensified aggression against Palestinians, Israel conducted a mass starvation campaign. It has reached beyond catastrophic levels, particularly across the northern parts of the Gaza Strip in the past month, severely exacerbating Israeli-created and internationally sanctioned humanitarian crisis. And generally, starvation tactics include blockades, water deprivation, destruction of food systems, and widespread damage to civilian infrastructure, which often result in forced displacement. And in perpetrating its current genocide, Israel systematically destroyed food sources within Gaza, and the destruction has targeted agricultural lands, fields, greenhouses, orchards, and irrigation systems, as well as key infrastructure such as flour mills, bakeries across the Strip. Additionally, we've seen Israel escalate its targeting of Palestinian fishermen, which has resulted in near total devastation of Gaza's fishing industry, which is a critical food source for the population. And by doing that, Israel has in effect destroyed and blocked all possible access to food within Gaza for its 2.3 million inhabitants, nearly half of whom are children, the group that is most vulnerable to malnutrition, starvation, and disease. And the population has been forced to almost entirely rely on food coming from outside of the Gaza Strip, which is subject to Israeli-controlled military checkpoints, arbitrary and inhumane restrictions and delays. That is, if it's allowed entry at all and distribution. And this is, of course, these like these measures and policies and practices that we've seen over the past year. They're part and parcel of Israel's prolonged closure, blockade, and isolation of the Gaza Strip over the past decades. So the restrictions that Israel has imposed on movement and goods between Gaza and the rest of Palestine, isolating Gaza by limiting imports, exports, and the freedom of movement since its military occupation in 1967, has been integral to the fragmentation of Palestinians, which is central to the Zionist settler-colonial project. And more specifically, from the early 90s through 2000s, these restrictions intensified over Gaza, often involving total closures. Probably the longest of these closures has extended between 2000 until 2023, right before or preceding the total siege that was imposed in October 2023. And throughout, Israel has systematically targeted and destroyed agricultural lands by bombing and bulldozing fields, spraying chemicals from air and land to destroy crops within the so-called buffer zone, uprooted trees, and restricted farmers and herders from access to their land. Again, we've seen over these decades that the military has also consistently targeted and prohibited the access of fishermen to the sea, which is a vital source of food. And in 2000, between 2007 and 2010, we've seen Israel's publicly acknowledged policy, which was to allow only enough goods into Gaza to keep people hungry, but not enough to spark a full humanitarian crisis. The Israeli Ministry of Health even calculated the calorie requirements based on the age and gender to determine the quantity and type of food permitted entry, allowing only the daily humanitarian portion of food and medicine. And even within this limited framework, Israel had often failed to meet its own guidelines, allowing only a fraction of the estimated necessary aid and restricting specific foods. So what I'm trying to say is that as a result of Israel's decades-long restrictions and military offensives in Gaza, over 53% of the population was food insecure, with more than 80% dependent on humanitarian aid before the current genocide. So Gaza's food insecurity and food domination did not begin in October 2023. The rapid onset of starvation and famine following the total siege that Israel imposed that October is evidence of Gaza's complete lack of food sovereignty, which is a condition similarly faced by Palestinians across the entirety of Palestine. And here it is important to note that while this paper focuses on the Gaza Strip, it also considers Israel's accelerated persecution of Palestinians throughout the rest of Palestine, including in the West Bank and Jerusalem, which has directly and indirectly compromised Palestinian food sovereignty and access. For example, through the accelerated land takeovers that we've seen in 2023, which has led to the displacement of entire herder, farmer, and Bedouin communities across the West Bank. And such land conquests mean the subjugation of Palestinians by disrupting their means of subsistence and livelihood. And over the years, we've seen how Israel has seized, dominated land, exploited its resources, many times to the point of depletion, reducing the native population to near total dependency on Israel itself, as well as on humanitarian aid and charity. This is, and other measures, have enabled Israel to capture and to dismantle the Palestinian food system, thereby eroding Palestinian food sovereignty and the right to food. And the paper looks into the reasoning and the impact behind the starvation campaign that Israel has carried out as part of its genocidal violence in the Gaza Strip. Specifically, it looks at, it tries to make the link in the context of how Israel's starvation is part of its logic and structure of elimination of Palestinians, and the impact, of course, that we see in the compounded suffering, especially among children, pregnant and breastfeeding women, the elderly, and those with existing health conditions, from severe malnutrition and dehydration to diseases to the extent of death. And it's important that the paper underlines that as with genocide, famine unfolds as a process, meaning that even if a ceasefire were reached and the siege is lifted, hunger and its individual, family, and societal scars would continue to persist because famine has long-term impacts. It inflicts serious physical and mental harm on those who survive it and results in harm to health and social trauma that can go on for generations. And there has been some recognition, in addition, of course, to the documentation and warnings from Palestinians themselves and Palestinian civil society about starvation and famine as genocidal acts. There has been some international recognition that has underscored this classification. For example, in July 2024, the UN experts declared that famine had spread across Gaza and identified it as a form of genocidal violence. The International Court of Justice provisional measures orders in the case of South Africa versus Israel, especially the orders of March and May, emphasized that Israel's starvation of Palestinians in Gaza constituted a possible breach of the Genocide Convention and therefore may amount to genocide. We didn't see the same, unfortunately, with the ICC prosecutors' classification of starvation as a war crime, completely sidelining Israel's broader campaigns of extermination and destruction in Gaza. And the last point that I want to raise is, does it really matter if starvation and famine are recognized as acts of genocide? And in all honesty, at this point, I don't know if it does matter or not in changing the reality, but I'm leaning towards more of a yes, it matters. Because settler colonies and settlers have historically used starvation and famine as a tool of conquest, subjugation, and genocide. And I think such recognition is important to acknowledging the structural nature of the Zionist Israeli settler-colonial domination and elimination, especially at a moment when it is on trial for genocide at the ICJ, and which has relied on various tools and methods over time to achieve its objectives, such as food domination and mass starvation. The recognition of such classification may also be important for purposes of prevention, accountability, and justice, to advancing the genocide legal framework under international law, moving it to align more closely within its foundational principles, including with Lemkin's aim to recognize starvation as a deliberate tool for genocide, which states deliberately excluded from the international definition of genocide. But in any case, today the legal debate does not really matter much. What matters is bringing the mass starvation, the extermination, and the destruction of Palestinian life to an end. I will stop here and pass it on to Tomaso to share his reflections as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Maha, and also on my side, thanks a lot for inviting us. And I'm very sorry that I cannot be there with you in person. I really hope that this can happen soon. I don't have that much time left, and Maha has already given a very extensive and very good presentation. But I think that also in line with what she just mentioned about why does it matter? Does it matter at all? I would like to bring in two considerations that come more from the food system perspective. Looking at the legal framework through the food system, maybe to think about potential partnership and moments of solidarity that can happen beyond the legal framework and beyond lawyers. And the reflection starts from two considerations or two problems that we see about the current legal framework and the way in which food is deployed or utilized in order to define whether or not there is a genocide or whether or not it's relevant for international law to intervene. The first problem that I identified, but it's not only me, and definitely the work of Michael Fakhri, the current special rapporteur on the right to food, is the term of reference. The first problem is the way in which the IPC, so the Integrated Food Security Phase classification, kicks in and plays a crucial role in kind of drawing a line from the moment where there is no famine to the moment where there is famine. A lot of issues have been raised about that. So there is a concern about a very late intervention of the IPC with the definition and classification of famine. There is a sort of fear also that I personally perceive by interacting with members of the IPC, fear of declaring famine, because declaring famine seems that is presented or is perceived as a failure of international humanitarian aid and of the international humanitarian framework. And so the IPC that is somehow holding it together seems to have a hard time defining and accepting the declaration of famine. There is also an issue that the declaration of famine is not peoples-based and is not based on the experience of people. So there is this idea that numbers matter more than what the people are expressing. And also the way in which the IPC intervene is incapable of grasping and perceiving what Maha was discussing and describing, which is the sort of slow violence through which food is weaponized, not on the moment, but also through decades and through time, and eventually creating a condition of complete annihilation of the food system and starvation and famine. So that is with the IPC, and that what is happening is that when the legal system looks at the IPC as the term of reference to decide whether or not something has to be done, it creates this sense of exceptionalism. So this idea that only if the IPC has recognized that it's relevant, we intervene, and so creates this idea that is sort of that there are thresholds that have to be exceeded in order for the legal system to kick in, and we think, and I think that that they can really marginalize or silence a lot of the situation and the reality that Palestine, but not only Palestine, have been experiencing, and Palestinians have been experiencing. One way through the lenses of food system to intervene and propose an alternative way of dealing with food, the genocide, and the legal framework is to mobilize other two notions that Maha has already mentioned. On the one hand, the notion of the right to food, and in particular the close connection between the right to food, the right to natural resources, and the right to self-determination. So there is a way in which this right that is somehow all-encompassing, that has been defined in multiple ways, really links and ties with the idea itself for people, the idea itself for people in the relationship, the connection with territory, and the possibility to produce their own food, and having access to food is something that characterizes them and make them being. But even more interesting, although a little bit more debatable from a legal perspective, is the idea of food sovereignty and the right to food sovereignty. I can't really take that much time going into the details of what it is, but it's important for those who don't know about that there is to know that there is a UN declaration on the rights of peasants, UNDROP, that was eventually adopted in 2018, so it's already 6 years, with 119 votes in favor and 7 votes against. And interestingly, both Israel, United Kingdom, and the United States are part of those 7 countries that voted against the rights of peasants and other people working on land. And in the preamble of UNDROP, as it's usually called, there is this reference to food sovereignty as the right to define the food and agricultural system. And Article 15 then makes a close connection between the right to food sovereignty and the right of peasants and other people working in rural areas to determine their own food and agricultural system. So again, like food sovereignty and the right to food sovereignty making a close connection with self-determination and the link between people, territory, and identity. And definitely we think the notion of the right to food sovereignty and the notion of the right to food would be way better and more capable, more appropriate in order to define the legal framework that applies in the case of weaponization of food and the use of food in context of genocide, and the use of food in context of violations like the one that Israel is currently perpetuating against the Palestinian people in Gaza and the whole Palestine. So just to conclude, the idea, and that's very speculative, is we have a framework where food is understood and utilized with regards to the Genocide Convention in a very sort of exceptional way. Maybe a different definition and different legal tools could be much more appropriate to actually make sure that these kind of egregious violations have visibility and definitely to legal accountability. Thanks a lot.